Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to stop in and talk to me today. Now, you guys do a lot of interesting stuff training-wise, but your work on creativity really is inspiring to me. I'd like you to dive in a bit about that with me today, if you're okay with it.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I'm interested in is how we as individuals stay creative. Before we start to talk about the corporate side, I think, it takes creative people to make a creative company to start with. How do we, one, lose that creativity, and then how do we get it back? Because I know you talk a lot about how people have lost that edge or lost that flow state.
Well, that's right. The research that we've looked at shows that 98% of children score high in divergent thinking. So that's a huge amount. And we're talking about 3 to 5 year olds, meaning they can connect things together, they can make the jumps. And as that gets up to adults, people have said that 98% of adults don't score high, so only 2% of adults score high on that divergent thinking or the ability to connect things together. So we have started to think, well, what happened? What went wrong? I mean, we seemed, it's not like some people say, well, I'm not creative. Well, that may not be true. It may be they were creative as children, but something happened in their childhood or their environment or their school system or university or even at work that pretty much killed their creativity, and that was it. There was no more reason for them to do it or no more option to do it. And yet, ironically, we're now in a situation where one of the largest CEO surveys and the World Economic Forum have both said with the coming of age of AI to future-proof our jobs, really the most important thing we're going to need now is that creativity, that ability, and we're not talking about an artistic creativity, we're talking about the ability of what children can do. They can make these jumps by connecting two totally unrelated things together to come up with something that we may not have seen. And funnily enough, that's what we're going to be asked to do now in our workplace, and yet we were probably better off when we were young.
So, do we lose it because it's a skill that we're not practicing, or do we lose it just because of society? Like, how does that happen?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I remember going into a school where we interviewed all the kids from grade kindergarten right through to year 12. Every single class we went into, an international school. And in kindergarten, we asked the kids who thinks they're creative, and all the hands were, rising as high as they could, and they were so excited, me. And literally, as we went through every single grade, the graph went down in a 45-degree drop-off. By the time we got to year 12, one kid put his hand up.
So they thought that they were less creative as they got older.
Yeah, and so we were a bit courageous, so we went to the teachers that we had a good relationship with and said, hey guys, what's going on in the school? And one of the teachers, my daughter's teacher at the time, said, look, the problem is we reward correctness. Yeah. We don't reward creativity.
I can see, and I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in America, there's not much focus being put on success in creative careers. A lot of time as you grow and your parents or your teachers talk to you, like, oh, if you want to be successful, be an engineer, an accountant, a finance major, or something like that you don't necessarily associate with creativity.
Well, creativity is about taking risks, and the other problem is creativity has been often hijacked by the concept of artistic or dramatic creativity. So when we see that word, we don't really connect it into business practices, but I understand creativity is connecting two things together, or 1 + 1 = 3, so you can come up with something better, or in banking terms, how to do more with less.
Yep.
So in that sense, yes, we are asked in the workplace to do that every day, but most of our school has not measured that. Most of our school has been giving us multiple choice, and we've got to spit those questions back. Ironically, Steve Jobs got kicked out of school because he was given A, B, C, or D, and he said, I don't like either of those, but what about if I take A and connect it to D and come up with E? And the teacher said, no, you can't do that. But that's what a creative person says. They're looking outside the A, B, C, D, and E, and they're saying, is there something better? Can we combine the A's and the B's to come up with an E or an F or a Z? Yeah. But school doesn't encourage that. It pushes you through it. And therefore, when you get into the workplace, if you want to be successful, you can't take risks, because you can do 10 successful things and 1 failure, and guess what gets marked against your name? It's the failure.
You talked about the kids being more creative as they were younger. I can think about that when I was a little kid in kindergarten. A stick could be anything, right? A rock could be anything. I'm 40 years old now, and a stick's a stick.
Yeah. So we can't see things that we could see, and look, people will blame. I mean, we do know the creative quotient, CQ, has been dropping since the mid-90s, whereas IQ continues according to the Flynn effect. getting 10% better per generation. I like to ask our audience, why has CQ been dropping since the 90s? And of course, people will say the internet, and we love to throw everything at the internet or smartphones. But at the end of the day, you saw something in a stick because you took the time to see that. Nowadays, a stick's a stick because you don't have time to do anything else with it.
Yeah.
Stick's a stick, and the next thing that comes along in front of your face is probably an iPhone, and now that's taken up your time. So definitely we had more time as children to explore. And you're absolutely right, creativity is like a muscle. I think if we don't use it, it will atrophy. And therefore, if we're not encouraged to use it as we go through school and get rewarded for correct answers, and then in the workplace, we're also rewarded for our KPIs and our correct answers, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, I want to challenge the idea of the internet real quick, being kind of the culprit here, because I think about it from when I was in high school in the 90s. I didn't have access to the internet, and if I wanted to find inspiration for something or learn something or find something that someone else was doing, I had to really go to the library or find some other way to find it. Today, I have a lot of creative inspiration at my fingertips through the internet. Maybe I'm using it wrong if my creativity is dropping, or maybe a lot of other people are. I mean, I don't get the correlation.
No, well, actually, yeah, you're right. I threw out the word internet probably as the not the cause behind it. I think it is the lack of time that is sucking into our lives, the amount of time we spend wasted doing non-creative things. But like anything, it can be a force for good and a force for evil. But just remember, I mean, one of the things that we discover blocks creativity is narrow-mindedness and insulation. So just quickly back to that, we worked with a neuroscientist and a psychologist to look at the things that block creativity, and two of the things were narrow-minded and insulation. If you think about right now, there are thousands of social media engineers directly designed to keep us on their sites, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, building algorithms.
Netflix, damn you, Netflix.
Building algorithms to say, hey, you like this, come on this one. Because their model of business is growth, not just profitability, but growth. And so we are being told to go down rabbit holes where we're getting fed what they want us to be fed. We're not necessarily broadening our horizon. We should be using the internet and the digital to look at what's going on in the world and seeing other people's perspectives. I mean, that's what it should be used. And I might be a Democrat, so heck, let's see why do Republicans think like that? But instead, it's the opposite.
You can't say things like that in America. Let me see what the other side thinks. It's not allowed.
That's right, because we've been algorithmed into going down these rabbit holes, and we're seeing the polarization happening more and more. But without getting political, from a creativity perspective, that inability to look at other people's viewpoints and empathize and put yourself in other person's position and see a problem from a different perspective. Yes, the internet is absolutely there for us to see it, but the algorithms that are trying to control my internet diet is not letting me see it, because they want to keep pushing me the same material to keep me on their site. So I wouldn't say the internet is wrong, and I wouldn't say it's killing our creativity, but unfortunately at the moment, from a time perspective and from a narrow-mindedness perspective or insulation perspective, we're not using it to our advantage to become creative.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that, because I'm as guilty as anyone is binging, especially with Netflix. Like, I've binged way too many, especially the Marvel seasons when those come out. But also, like, from what you said about the way it doesn't allow us to flex our perspective, it is true that, at least for me, I often find myself kind of in an echo chamber when I'm online, whether it's if I'm going on Reddit or who I see in my Facebook feed or on Twitter. A lot of times I'm just looking at things that I would sort of agree with anyway. And that's obviously algorithmic in nature, that it's feeding me back things that I've engaged with in the past.
So again, we won't blame, we're not going to blame Facebook or blame the internet, but what we're going to say is the principles behind that is the things that kill creativity we know are narrow-mindedness and insulation. They're 2 of the 7. And so therefore, if you're using these tools to just become more narrow-minded and more insular and find more people agreeing with you to make you feel good and make you go to sleep saying, wow, there's people in my tribe that actually believe in me and believe in what I believe, that's not going to help you become creative, because creative people are always looking for other alternatives. I hate to use the word thinking outside the box, but
everyone
because everyone uses it, but they have shown in research that the more you travel, the more you speak other languages, all these things increase your creativity. And so you have to ask why. Well, when you travel, you're exposing yourself to different cultures, you're exposing yourself to different countries, you're exposing yourself to different ways of doing things. I've just come back from China, and they were quite converted about what's going on in China. And as a Westerner, I think, wow, all these cameras looking at me, and everything being in a state where everyone's looking at us all the time, that freaked me out. But I have to look. But it was really interesting to stop and think, well, what's it like from their perspective? What's it like running a country with 1 billion people in it? I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with it. But I had to stop reinforcing my own bias and start to say, how do they see it? And that is opening up our narrow-mindedness. And from that rich exchangement of ideas, we can actually start to come up with creative ideas. But if everyone sits inside their own echo chamber, you won't be creative.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of it comes down to understanding the context of the situation you're in, right? And so if you can step outside of your own mind and say, oh, well, this is the context of China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you take, let's move into the more generic stuff of design thinking. I mean, the very first stage of design thinking is putting yourself in your customer's shoes.
Empathize, right?
Empathizing. You can't do that if you're living in an echo chamber. So therefore, that's why the more people travel, the more languages they speak, the more exposure they get to other points of view. So as I said, instead of just looking at one person's point of view and continue feeding yourself off that, go and say, I'm deliberately going to go and see if I can understand what the other person's saying. You don't have to agree with them, but that exposure allows you to see a much bigger picture, and from that bigger picture, there will be more creative ideas for you to find.
Now, if I look at that from an individual perspective, then switch over to kind of how a business would look at creativity. A lot of times, it's very, very difficult to get out of that echo chamber at work. Whether I was an engineer for a long time, and now I worked on a team of 8 people, of 8 engineers, and it is very much an echo chamber in that one department. I've also been an entrepreneur where I've had companies as large as 12 people. And a lot of times within the company, it becomes sort of, especially if you're hiring everyone, you sort of hire people in a certain mindset, and it can easily become this sort of echo chamber. How does a company kind of work around getting people out of that perspective, or getting teams out of that perspective?
Look, I mean, let's go back to as simple as disc profiling. I've worked with a team where the boss has employed all his own team, and when we've done the profiling, they're all exactly the same. And I remember he looked and he went, "Oh heck!" And again,
I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, and we were using because we do. We are attracted to people that think the same as us, feel the same as us. Talk the same as us, and often I go to these Asia Pacific conferences, and all the Australians sit at one table over dinner, and all the Singaporeans at another, and the Chinese at the other. And I'm saying, this is your chance. You come together once a year as a conference group.
Yeah.
Don't sit with the people you sit with every day at the office. Go and find someone from another culture, sit with them, learn from them, understand from them. That will open up your palette to see more colours, to see more creative ideas. So you're absolutely right. Companies, we do tend to employ like-minded people.
Yeah.
We tend to hang out with like-minded people. They make us feel good because they make us feel that our worldview is the right worldview.
Yeah.
A creative person is courageous in the sense that they have no fear. They are happy to go and not necessarily agree with, but happy to go and listen to other people's ideas. And so in a company, I think it's really important to do some sort of profiling. We've developed an innovation one called an ICLI that looks at explorers and preservers. And typically, the creative people are the explorers. But what happens when they come back to work and most people are just conservative and preserving and saying, we don't want to do that. We tried that last year. But that tension can rip a company apart. But that tension can also help a company move forward if you can recognize the value that each person gives to that process.
I like what you said there. The tension can rip the company apart, or it can move them forward. So what's the catalyst there for one way or the other? So what's the catalyst that tension rips the company apart? But more importantly, what's the catalyst for a company that's able to take that tension and use it as propellant?
Consciousness. I mean, I don't want to sound. I'm saying that.
One word. Okay, done. Interview's over.
Well. The company where the tension rips them apart is when they're not aware of what's happening. They can't see it. There's pressure. There's tension. There's personalities politically fighting for each other. The stronger personality wins, not necessarily the correct one. And they can't see what's happening. I hate to say it, but you need to bring in an independent facilitator who can see it from a bird's eye perspective and say, look, you've got the tension there. Let's use that tension to move forward. So what we're trying to do is take the diversity of a team It's funny that a lot of these companies are saying they're diverse because we want to be seen as a diverse company, and really a lot of companies are saying they're diverse because they don't want to get into a PR nightmare. But if they were genuine, the stuff that's coming out of Silicon Valley at the moment.
Oh yeah.
If they were genuine about creativity, they would have a diverse team.
Yeah.
Not because it's a PR nightmare, but they would recognise that put people on the Google bus. There's 10 people on the Google bus, and 9 of them are white 30-year-old males, all live in the same suburb. Really, are they going to have a creative discussion? Are they going to understand what it must be like to be a single person from a different culture, a single mother? Are they going to understand how they use it? No, not if they're all the same. So the diversity issue is not so much a PR issue for me. It should be about the fact that we genuinely want creativity in our company, and therefore if we do that, we're going to have diverse opinions. But the danger of those diverse opinions is they cause tension, and so we flee from that tension rather than embrace it. We should be embracing that tension, facilitating it, and letting it pull us forward, rather than creating these echo chambers where we walk away feeling good. Because if we do that, we won't get the creativity.
Now you brought up Silicon Valley, so I'll go there. And I've been following it, as I'm sure you have. Do you think that a lot of that lack of diversity, the sort of monolith that the Valley has become, is one of the reasons that there's struggle with creativity in a lot of the bigger companies?
I think you've had some creative geniuses, and we can name them all because they're always through the papers all the time. They're not necessarily great leaders. That's the other thing people ask me. Was this person a great leader? I said no, but they're a great innovator. Yeah. They're a creative person, and survivorship bias. We always read about the good ones.
Yeah. And
you don't need, the whole company doesn't need to be creative. Sometimes you only need 1 or 2 great people. But when you lose them, there's a big hole in the market. If you took what happened with Uber over the last year. And this might date the podcast a little bit, but it started with a very creative person that said they wanted to make mobility as effective as running water. Yeah. And I'll use the out of the box example again, but you can improve taxi services as much as you like. They may end up being as good as Singapore. Yeah. But then all of a sudden, someone's looking in a completely different way and saying, well, hang on, there's thousands of other cars on the road. Why can't we use them? That's the 1 + 1 = 3. So the concept of Uber, or in Asia, it's Grab, and they're both arguing about which came first. But the concept was always
both owned by SoftBank.
Yeah, that the concept was there that we can use something more than taxis. So it wasn't about improving taxis. It was about improving the whole, improving mobility. So there were some really creative ideas there. But then, about a year ago, a report came out on how toxic Uber was as a company. The CEO resigned. The new CEO basically said, look, we were too busy winning. So they moved from being creative to looking at the culture of their company and the bullying that was going on and the narrow-mindedness. So everything that we researched about what kills creativity, ironically, found its way into Uber, even though it is considered in all the case studies a creative breakthrough. That's fine, but that's a one-off. And I'm sick of reading about these companies that have these one-off ideas, become really popular. You go to conferences, you hear about companies with triple-digit growth, and they're gone in 2 years' time. What we need to do is, if we genuinely want proper creativity, as you said yourself, employ the right people, attract the creative people to your organisation and look after them, and create an environment that allows them to be creative, not a toxic environment where the report with Uber, it was a dog-eat-dog culture, it was an alpha male generated culture, so there's the diversity gone. What female wants to work in an alpha male generated culture with narcissistic leaders?
Not too many, yeah.
Yeah, so there's sure, it's a PR nightmare for these companies, but it's a bigger issue than the fact that they're not employing diversity and they're not using that diversity to explore ideas, using empathy to understand exactly what people want by getting out there and seeing things bigger than what their little tiny picture.
Now you talk about that diversity of thought, and get away from Uber for a second and look at Google. I think not too many people would argue against Google as being a creative company. They've done quite a few, or at least argue against them being an innovative company. I'll leave you to decide creativity. I'm no expert in that realm. But I think it was 2 years ago an engineer got forced out.
Changed them all.
Yeah, and essentially for having an opinion, a thought opposite of the majority at Google. Is that a sign that they're struggling with that diversity?
Look, I mean, here we are. We've just picked on 3 of the most successful companies in the world, so we're either going to be very popular by some and hated by others. But look,
hey, as long as they're listening.
Look, let's talk about these companies, and let's be a little bit
Critical. Yeah.
Yes, Google is well known for its Google Canteen. You've heard me talk about that and how they've engineered the canteen to make it a place where people can meet and join and have that, dare I say, connection of ideas. So the engineer can meet the software person, can meet the salesperson, and they've actually designed the canteen in a way that they want to encourage people to stay at the canteen. And I think that is absolutely fantastic because they've known, I don't know if they're making the canteen because they're altruistic or they've got a lot of money, but I do know that they're a science company and they've done their research as case studies on Google's research to know that the best creative ideas don't happen in cubicles, they happen in a place where people can share and talk. But then if you flip that on the switch, on the opposite side, several years ago, Google got in trouble again. I'll go back to the Google bus. People being picked up and bypassing all the local communities. They were making a joke that if 10 people on the bus, they were most of them white 30-year-olds, males. So now all of a sudden you've got the other issue, and that is within that culture, the culture's become so strong that it's going to turn back in on itself, because what's going to happen is the lack of diversity is gone, and all of a sudden someone speaks up. Heck, he went to a training session, he was asked for his feedback. It wasn't even meant to be a public feedback. He said he's an engineer. He may not have had the most social skills in the world. He just said, look, this is my feedback with the session. He got fired for it. He's bringing a case action against Google at the moment, so unfortunately it's become very political. But the concept behind it of not being able to speak out, we've got to be really careful of. Now, of course, we don't want to offend people, so it is definitely a paradox. It is definitely a very difficult line to walk. But if we're serious about creativity, we have to create safe environments where people can share ideas, where people can throw out ideas that they feel are not necessarily, even if throwing out an idea, you may not agree with it, but you throw it out just to see where it goes. Because we even know, and with brainstorming, for example, the best ideas only come in the last 30% of brainstorming. But if you're in a company where there's no diversity and no one's allowed to speak out, who's going to throw out a crazy idea of brainstorming for fear of being shut down and saying
ostracized?
That's a stupid idea? You'll never get to the great ideas if you're not prepared to throw around all the crazy ideas. So if we're in these toxic cultures where there's A-type personalities ruling, where there's a culture of fear, where there's a culture of narrow-mindedness, where there's a culture of a controlling boss, these are all the things that we've identified in our book that blocks the creativity, as we call it, who killed creativity, a bit of a play off the Cluedo game. Who killed creativity, with what weapon and where, is really what we're talking about, because we're trying to identify for those companies that are courageous enough to use that as a diagnostic. We're trying to say, hey, you guys, you can do all the design thinking you like, you can read all the books, you can watch all the YouTube videos, you can have a hackathon every Friday night. But if you have a toxic work environment that does not allow those people to bring out that childlike creativity, so earlier on in this podcast we talked about children in school, now we've moved to corporate. So you can see why adults have lost their creativity. If we don't create an environment that allows people to be creative and allows diversity and allows, in a non-offensive way, freedom of thought for people to explore ideas where they're not going to feel they're going to get fired for giving feedback that they're asked to do, then we're not going to get the creative ideas. So we have looked at cycles of creativity, not only in companies, but also generations of cultures. We've gone back as far as Egypt. When you think about it,
Egypt, it's a little far.
It's a little far, but Egypt was one of the most innovative countries in the world back then. What happened? That's an interesting thought. Angkor Wat, Greece. What happened in Rome? All these great civilizations and companies tend to go through the same cycles. And they start off very creative with a couple of entrepreneurial leaders, but before they know it, they get bogged down in these toxic environments. And our research is looking at how do you make sustainable creativity, not just accidentally stumbling across the right thing because the right personality was in the right place at the right time. That's survivorship bias. We love to read about those people. Most of us are not going to be that company, and we're not going to be that individual. So how do we make creativity sustainable, and how do we make it for everyone, not just for the freaks?
So how?
Well,
well, let's not give it all away, but that is definitely.
The how is start by asking that question, and not just assuming it. That's whether you're the number one company in the world, which is Google, and they are ranked as the number one innovative company in the world at the moment. But heck, if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we could be talking about Wang Computers or Borders Books or Kodak.
Dell,
so let's not kid ourselves.
Gateway Computers.
Yeah, I mean, with the list can go on, but they're forgotten.
And it's dynamic. But so let's think about that. The sustained creativity, which I think I agree with you that a lot of companies struggle with that, just like sustained innovation. And you said a lot of companies start out very creative, very innovative, and I've had the same experience myself as an entrepreneur where we start with a very unique idea that's challenging,